In this short video, I'm going to give you 5 tips or 5 ways how you can make the most out of an academic conference. So this is particularly for people, for PhD students and early career researchers who haven't attended many conferences, or maybe you have the first one coming up yet. So this is based on my own experience. So first of all, you need to carefully think about the conference that you're going to select. So most of the time when you are in a specific research group, you will have annual conferences that most people will attend. So it can be because it's really like in your area, or maybe it's just a tradition that you go to these specific conferences. However, I would say there are many more things beyond just those conferences, and it can be really beneficial to go outside of your comfort zone. So especially for those who haven't attended many conferences, an easy way to go into it or to ease into it is to consider the smaller regional or even online opportunities for early career researchers. So these are often much smaller, so you have a much more personal feel to it. And what's also important to consider is that they might be free of charge. So if you wanted to expand your network but you don't necessarily have the funds available to go everywhere, that's why these opportunities are very important. It also means that when you actually go to a bigger conference, you'll feel more confident just by having attended those smaller conferences. So the other thing to consider is what type of conference you would prefer. So here I specifically mentioned the larger conferences, which typically are more expensive, versus smaller conferences. So the smaller conferences do advantages here because it is much smaller, that in terms of networking it might be easier. If you go to a large conference, you might feel somewhat lost. However, you know that in the larger conferences you will have all the major players in your field. So there might be more talks of people that you're interested in, and especially if you have some major findings to report, it can be very beneficial to go to a larger conference. So think about what suits you. Do you want to have a conference where you have, for instance, 20 parallel sessions, but you know that the people you really wanted to talk to are there? Or do you want something smaller where you'll be able to network a little bit better? But my key tip here is to consider not just the conferences that everyone goes to that you know in your group, but sometimes the most beneficial act is when you actually look outside of your own field. So for instance, I work on polymers, but often it's, for instance, the application that I'm most interested in. So there's some of my students who've gone on to conferences on antibiotics or antimicrobial resistance, or my more biological or clinical conferences. This is where you find the people that might not necessarily understand the details of your work, but they will be very interested in collaborating with you because they can see the application of what you're doing. Now, the second thing to think about is how you are going to attain the funding to attend these conferences. So you need to be fully aware of all the options that are available. There are many more bursaries than you probably are aware of. So talk to the other people in your group, especially the more experienced PhD students or even the postdocs, and they will have applied for these bursaries. So often each PhD student will have their own budget, but it doesn't get you very far in terms of traveling, especially because traveling is getting more and more expensive. So you should check what bursaries are available, for instance, via your own university or via the regional networks. But also there are a lot of learning societies that offer these bursaries to early career researchers. So in my case, this is particularly the Royal Society of Chemistry that has some excellent opportunities available to look into. So if you are limited in terms of funding, it can be very interesting to consider conferences that are specifically targeted towards early career researchers, because a lot of these conferences at least will be free of charge in terms of registration fees. You only have to pay for your travel. And this is also, since COVID, there's many more online opportunities. So this can also be a way of boosting your network without having to spend a lot of money on going somewhere. And then there's also environmental considerations that are becoming more and more important, where people try and actually limit their travel. So some of these conferences are not just online, but they're hybrid. So you should be aware of what opportunities are available. Now, if you are a PhD student, usually in the beginning you will not have many results. So the first conference you might go to, you might just listen into, just get a feel for what these conferences are like, or to maybe get some inspiration for your own research. But as you are progressing in your PhD, and especially if you might have a publication available, we would expect that at least in your final year you would attend one like international or one bigger conference. So this depends on the bigger conference, might not necessarily be far away, but we would expect that at least everyone has a presentation because that's actually part of your PhD training. And then I would say in the other years you're more likely to have like a regional or like a local event that you would attend. Now, in order to be fully aware of what you can do, and you obviously need to closely liaise this with your supervisor, is to make a conference schedule, and you really need to plan a year ahead. This seems like a lot, but for a lot of the bigger conferences, you need to submit abstracts sometimes even a year in advance. So you should be aware of what the opportunities are here. And I would also suggest that you can obviously, a lot of people think that if they submit an abstract, that it means that you have to go. But in terms of the funding, sometimes you need to have, for instance, an oral presentation accepted before you can actually guarantee that you have the funding to go. So it might be better to spread your chances and to apply for a couple of different conferences and then see what funding available you have at hand. Now, when you physically get to the conference, how can you make the most out of the networking opportunities? And a lot of my students, I tell them this is a skill that you will learn, because the first conference you're going to attend, you're not very likely to know a lot of people. And if you do know a lot of people and you go with your own group, it's very comfortable to stay within that group. So you're not necessarily going to interact very much with other people. And we're not all naturally extroverts, neither am I. I also feel a bit uncomfortable going to people talking about the research that I do. However, it becomes like a skill that you will learn as you go along. So ways to kind of make it a little bit easier for yourself. So what you can do, a lot of you use social media. So I've seen a lot of people that advertise their posts or their talk up front via, for instance, LinkedIn or other social media tools. Or sometimes if your supervisor is giving a talk or someone else, they also refer to the poster of their PhD students. So that will also help to create a little bit more awareness, and people might actually find out where you are a little bit easier, especially in bigger conference where it's just easy to get lost. Now here you will see that if you are stuck by a poster and there's nobody around, or you feel there's no one around, and especially this can be awkward because a lot of these poster presentations are during the lunch breaks or even during dinner, so you end up kind of juggling your food and your poster, it will be very beneficial to talk to other PhD students. So if there's someone right next to you, they're probably in a similar position where there's no one really asking them questions. So, and most often when people see that other people are talking, they would actually come and see you. So you automatically get more of a crowd. So don't be afraid to just talk to people when they're just walking past your poster, because most of the time they're very happy to talk to you about things. Where most of the networking happens, as most academics will know, we often have, we always have coffee breaks, but sometimes there's some social events within the networking as well. So these are really like the events that you need to make the most of. So I would suggest that even if you're just standing in the line to get your coffee, you can just make some small talk. It doesn't even need to be research-wise, but this is just for you to expand your network and just to talk to people. So really make the most out of these events, because even if you just talk to these people, you know their name, and you never know when you might bump into them in the future when you need, for instance, someone with the skills that they have. And this is where my key tip comes in. Most academics, or all academics, love talking about their own work. So if you think there's a professor that you're not sure how to approach, or you think that they might not be willing to talk to you as a PhD student, you'll be surprised in terms of academic egos how really people enjoy talking about their research. So don't be too worried about this. The other thing I would say, often you get nowadays you don't get booklets very often, but you would have a notepad and you would take some notes, and it can be very helpful actually after the conference to go over these notes and to have a look at the posters or the talks that you were interested in. So if you didn't have a chance to speak to specific people during the conference, do email them straight after when it's still fresh in your head. And if you mention where you saw them, what particularly you were interested in, you will see you get a lot of connections out of this or new ideas. Because sometimes, not directly during the conference, but a few weeks later, you're looking at a new research avenue, and then you realize, okay, it would be very helpful to talk to this specific person. Now, the tips were actually for when you have your poster or a talk, or if you're just attending a conference in general. Preparation is always key. So it should be key to try out your talk in a very familiar environment, such as like a group meeting or with some other PhD students that you work with. Just that you know how it runs and that you're really comfortable with it. So what you do need to consider is the type of conference that you're going to. Are you going to go to a conference that's really specialized in your field? So are you going to have other experts in that field? Or is it a very broad conference where you have a lot of people that don't necessarily know much about the basics that you're doing, and then you really need to explain those basics from scratch? So when you make your presentation, consider the audience very well. And then even if you're doing a poster where you're maybe not necessarily asked to prepare like a talk, make sure that you have a short elevator pitch ready. And just make sure that you're not put on the spot. And often this is like a 10-minute talk. So this is just a simple way of promoting yourself. So make sure that you know what kind of key points you have in mind. The other advantage is when you prepare your presentation, you will automatically see what kind of questions people have in mind. So that can make you feel a lot more comfortable if you know what they are potentially going to ask. And sometimes when you make your presentation, you're almost alluding to questions, and a lot of people would be interested, okay, what's coming next? What are the main hurdles in your research? So make sure that you are kind of prepared for that. So the key tips here for me, as being a chair, always stick to time. I've actually found that most early career researchers don't have any problems with it. It's mostly the professors that go over time. But I would say that's very important. And also make sure that the presentation in terms of layout is very clear, but there is something about it that stands out. So make sure that like some of the key points that you want your audience to remember, make sure that it's memorable. And then finally, really try to enjoy the experience. I think my first conference, I was still feeling a little bit awkward, and I tried to find some people that I know and just stuck to that, but it does get easier. When you do a conference, people will have their own particular preference. So some people, because they're naturally very outgoing, they're very happy to go to very big conferences where they don't know anyone, and they can just easily talk to anyone who's on that table. However, there are people who are naturally not comfortable with that, and they prefer much smaller conferences. So what kind of type or what kind of experience you prefer is really your own personal preference. So bear that in mind when you pick out your conferences. So I mentioned when you're there, there's never going to be a program where you're going to think like, oh, when you have a full day, initially you might think there's only a few talks that would really pique your interest. However, it could be very interesting when you're there, and just for the experience, attend those talks that are outside of your own field. So that would really help maybe to get you inspiration for like finding a direction of your research you weren't very aware of. And then what I mentioned about the coffee breaks and the social events, making new connections is always useful. It doesn't necessarily need to be someone you're going to work with directly. Sometimes it's just going to be very beneficial to hear the experience from someone who's at the same stage as you, or someone who's more experienced and who could kind of mentor you and help you along the way. So making that connections is key, not just for your own research per se, but also just in general for career development. Now, finally, I want to say what's key here, networking is a skill. So don't underestimate it. It's not something that you can just rely on. It's something that you need to nurture and grow. And it can be very uncomfortable talking about yourself. However, if you're going to go for job interviews, and particularly like for academic work, you need to learn how to promote yourself. So it's something that you need to learn how to slowly become a little bit more comfortable with. Hopefully you've enjoyed these tips, and if you wanted to have a look at more videos that are targeted at early career researchers, then do have a look at this playlist. Thanks for watching.